Everybody. I'm Harvey Butcher, Director of the Observatory, for people who don't know me. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce His Excellency Mr. Jeffrey Bleich, Ambassador to Australia from the United States. Mr. Bleich has an extraordinarily rich and varied background. He calls himself a recovering lawyer. But he's not only practiced law in the United States, his legal career is characterized by a long-standing commitment to international law. He received a master's in public policy from Harvard, law degree from the University of California. He's clerked as well as argued before the United States Supreme Court. He worked at the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal and was special rapporteur to the International Court of Arbitration. He assisted the special prosecutor for the International Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. Served as an officer and member of numerous foreign policy organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations and Human Rights Watch. He's taught international human rights at University of California, Berkeley's School of Law, and in written and lectured extensively on the International Criminal Court. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Bleich served as director of the White House Council on Youth Violence. In 2008, he was chair of the California State University Board of Trustees and president of the State Bar of California. Before being appointed as ambassador to Australia late last year, he served as special counsel to President Barack Obama. Since arriving in Australia, he's been highly visible around the country, appearing at numerous events, including the Adelaide Festival and the Royal Canberra Show, and even served as guest conductor in the orchestra. He's well known for his collection of, get this, Elvis Presley memorabilia, and he hopes that President Obama doesn't decide to visit during January next year during the annual Elvis Festival in the parks. Mr. Bleich is convinced that human activities are changing the Earth's climate and has spoken passionately in the Australian media on the issue in the past several months. So he's most welcome to say a few words on the matter and whatever else he wishes to discuss today. Afterwards, he's prepared to answer questions, so while he's talking, think of some difficult questions to ask him. Excellency.
Great, well thank you Harvey, and thank you Roz and Sandy for having me here. I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate the introduction, and just having the opportunity to speak to so many brilliant scholars who have been studying the issue of climate change is a great opportunity for me. It reminds me of this, there was a remark that John F. Kennedy made when he had the Nobel laureates all at the White House for a state dinner, and he said, never before have so many brilliant minds been together in one room, in this room, since Thomas Jefferson ate here alone. And so since we know Thomas Jefferson didn't eat at Mount Stromlo, I think we can safely say this is perhaps the greatest collection of minds we've had here. So it's wonderful for me to have a chance to speak with you all. I would be happy to talk about some of the other experiences at the end, including, this is my Elvis pen. I actually have a pen that's got the little image of Elvis dancing on it, which really is not standard issue for diplomats, just we'll put it that way. And so it's true that I am an Elvis tragic. And I'm happy to talk about things like conducting the Canberra Symphony Orchestra, which, frankly, it's proof that adrenaline is a very powerful drug. But since you're all scientists and studying climate change, I'm going to try and confine my remarks today principally to that issue, and understand that the scientific community has much to teach the political world, and to some extent it may be helpful for me to give you some political perspectives from the United States on climate change and some of the issues that are being addressed in the United States with respect to it. So I want to start with this. Climate change is actually an interesting subject for people to discuss. It used to be in polite society. Diplomats are trained that we're not supposed to talk about religion, other sensitive topics, politics. And so people used to talk about the weather. Now the way to start a controversy is to talk about the weather. So, how it's changing, why it's changing, I think the existence of and causes of climate change are topics on which there's really no shortage of opinions and accusations, policies, fears, recriminations, conjecture. And while this is this isn't just true in the United States, it's true in other countries, I should make clear what the United States position is with respect to climate change, the United States government. First, climate change is real. Second, it is influenced by human factors, human production of greenhouse gas emissions. And it is among the most pressing challenges that's currently facing humanity. Full stop. That is the United States government position. The challenge is for scientists and policymakers to work together to allow the public and policymakers to better understand the bases for those judgments and the challenges that they present. America and Australia are two of the most energy-intensive economies on Earth. Our nations, like others, are built on economies that run on inexpensive fuels, principally coal and oil. But now we've got to confront the fact that burning those fossil fuels produces gases that trap heat and contribute to climate change. This is a critical reason why we need to develop alternatives, whether they're bridge technologies and launch of future technologies to get us to a sustainable energy future. Saying this to a bunch of scientists seems like, oh my God, are we going to have to sit here for 45 minutes while he tells us about science? What I want to do is explain to you how it has to be addressed in the policy world, where there are people who are, of different levels of confidence in scientists, in science, in the predictions that have been made by scientific bodies. It's okay. Thank you very much. I must have looked parched. And one thing that is helpful perhaps to you is to understand that climate change is just part of a much larger energy debate. And that one doesn't need to win every battle on the science of climate change in order to move governments, move policymakers, move societies in a better direction in terms of our energy use. How we use energy is not just the climate change issue. It's an economic issue, it's a health issue, it's a national security issue. And so, perhaps if you'll indulge me, I can speak a little bit about what that means for both the United States and Australia, because it may help you when you're talking to others about the nature of your research and the effect. First, of course, burning fossil fuels puts our health and our environment at risk. Even if one has debates about the extent to which human factors contribute, there's no debate that human factors do contribute to climate change. But it's not just the production of carbon, it's the production of other noxious gases through the burning of fossil fuels that damage our seas and skies. And the risks associated with climate change, to the extent that we control it, are massive. People have started to appreciate that more since the Gulf oil spill, that even if you have a very, very small risk of something very, very bad, you don't appreciate the risk until it materializes. That's one of the aspects of climate change, is that even for those who would diminish the risk, they have to appreciate that if they're wrong, the consequences are overwhelming. Talking about stranding millions of refugees, producing massive food and water shortages, huge dislocations in the world. No one understands better than you just exactly what those risks and hazards are. And it's important for you to be able to articulate them for policymakers so they can appreciate them. Not in apocalyptic terms, but in terms of this is reality. You've taken a bet, and if you're wrong about the bet, this is what happens. But even for those who are skeptical about some of the scientific research, there are other reasons that are also supported by hard data. One is the issue of competitiveness. Right now, our economies depend upon fuel sources that are exhaustible and will be exhausted at some point. Whoever develops a new, renewable, sustainable alternative is going to have a vast competitive advantage over our nations if we continue on the current path. To be competitive, countries are going to have to do a few things. One is embrace new, alternative, sustainable, renewable energy supplies. Second, use the energy that we have more efficiently, and eliminate all these external costs and risks that are associated with our energy use, whether it's healthcare or environmental destruction. And to do it in a way that creates more jobs, new technologies, because we're going to be displacing one sector, but hopefully embracing a much more robust, sustainable, and strong energy sector. The third is just a security issue. Right now, there are renewable energy sources out there, like wind, solar, hydro, other biofuels, that are available everywhere on the earth. Coal and oil may exist only in certain areas. That gives the countries that exist in those certain areas tremendous leverage over other nations. They take a lot of money from those nations, and they can hold the source of their entire economies hostage. We're currently in the United States beholden to many nations that don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. If we could develop a better use of solar, we could develop whatever it is, blue-green algae for biofuels. We could have a cleaner, safer nuclear future in the United States. We could figure out the disposal issues and transportation issues there. We could improve our wind and hydro technologies. We could be energy independent. And that would change our work geopolitically. And it would avoid hostile nations from attempting to use energy as a weapon. So it isn't just climate change. The greatest of our many challenges is developing sustainable energy for a whole variety of factors. Now, if you listen to the discussions within public fora, you'd think this is impossible to do. To change over from the energy system that we currently have to a different kind of energy system. And again, I'm not talking scientists, talking about politics of it. But, while it's not easy, if you look back over human history, this is not the biggest challenge that we faced, including in the energy sphere. We've evolved in our own histories through a whole variety of energy systems. Energy, where did it start? First we used human muscle, and we started using animals. Then wood, wind, and water, and coal, petroleum, and nuclear energy, all these different forms of energy to power our growth. There was even a time when we used to send ships around the world to light our lamps with whale oil, which I think there's probably unanimity in the room. That was not our best plan for the future energy needs of the world. Our economies, fortunately for the whales, evolved and survived all those transitions into newer and better sources of energy. So if you go back through history, the economies that ultimately advanced in these periods were the ones that adapted best to supplying ample energy, food, and water. Now, compared to these earlier societies, and compared to many nations today, the US and Australia, I think, are in privileged positions. We've had a lot more warning. We have many more options. We have better technology. We have the ability to plan and to model and to use existing technologies that are bridge technologies to improve how we use legacy fuels until we make a full transition. And although the policymakers struggle with this, the people who actually have money invested, people whose bottom lines are on the line, they get it. You talk to oil companies, energy companies, coal businesses, they don't think oil and coal are going to be the source of our economies 100 years from now. They don't. They believe that these technologies will stay predominant for some period of time, but eventually they and the world are all going to be moving to low carbon, clean, sustainable energy supplies. The only difference that you find among these companies is the pace at which they want to do it. But they all understand they're going to have to do it. They're all going to have to do it within the next century. And some people are looking at the first 20 years of that century, and some are hoping they can hang out to the last 20 years. But that's the only difference. So, what's America's plan? Which may be helpful. And because I'm not going to talk about Australia's plan, or else this will be the shortest ambassadorship in history. We'll talk only about our own values and our own views on this subject. So let me talk to you about what we're doing at home. First, I think Americans understand that as one of the world's largest producers of energy, and its largest consumer, we have a duty to put our own house in order. We have already made an unprecedented investment in transforming our energy economy in the last 2 years. During the global financial crisis, I was working at the White House, as Harvey mentioned, and the mantra around the White House was, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So this was an opportunity, given that we had to revive our economy with stimulus funds, to focus stimulus in some important new directions. We put $80 billion into clean technology efforts, and that included investments, loans, incentives to support what we call shovel-ready clean tech programs, as well as research on everything from solar to hydrogen to biofuels, and fusion as well. And as a result of this historic investment, just in the last year and a half, we're now building our nation's first 3 electric vehicle plants. We've got 30 new battery and other electric vehicle component plants, and we're training people for these kinds of green jobs. And in fact, I think if some of you may have seen the article in the Australian last week, that there's a California-based company, A Better Place. I know people who work there, and their spouses are always saying, well, when my wife went to work there, I had to keep saying that, Sheila was going to a better place. It created some concern and confusion in the family. So maybe A Better Place could use a better name. But A Better Place is the electric car company that was chosen, Australia as the site of one of its first networks to test out this technology in anticipation of a major rollout in North America. So it's happening. These are investments that were made a year and a half ago, and now you're going to see electric cars rolling all over the United States. A major movement in a year and a half. About 3 years ago, you may have remembered, the movies coming out about who killed the electric car. Well, the electric car's back. It's like Jason with the hockey mask in those movies, People thought they killed it, but it's back. Second, we're addressing the demand side. We've raised our own fuel efficiency standards for cars and for appliances. We're promoting smart grids. We're promoting smart meters, smart technologies, just smart things generally to reduce waste and overconsumption. And in the past year, we've made, I think, the single largest investment in home energy efficiency in United States history. Third, we are closer than ever to passing comprehensive legislation that will power new industries and that will enhance, as I said, our national security by reducing dependence on fossil fuels. And in the bargain, we create millions of new jobs. This is a comprehensive bill that's gone through the House. It's now had a version introduced in our Senate by Senators Lieberman and Kerry. It's called the Power Act. It was crafted with bipartisan support, But now that we're coming up on midterm elections, who knows what that ultimate support is going to look like, but there have been some prominent members of the Republican Party who have stepped up and said that they support this bill because it's critical to America's future. And this legislation represents not just a fight against greenhouse gas emissions, but also a whole new chance for industry to regain, for American industry to gain the high ground on innovation, just as industry took the high ground in the communication revolution just 20 years ago in Silicon Valley and around the world. This is the next major technology revolution, clean tech. I won't go through all the details of the bill unless you really love details of 800-page bills, but it sets clear targets to cap emissions, reducing carbon emissions by 17% by the year 2005. I mean by the year 2020 from 2005 levels. It would be hard for us to reduce emissions for 2005 now. And reducing them by 80% by 2050. So it provides consumer rebates, it support for states, and it just eliminates market speculation so that you could have an effective cap and trade system, and it has a price collar around it so that there are minimums and maximums. Now, you can't predict what that final legislation is going to look like. We're going to go through the usual rough and tumble of legislation. But there's one thing clear, and that is in the United States, one way or another, we're going to find a price for carbon. Either it's going to be a cap and trade system, as in the House and Senate bills, or it's going to be a tax on carbon, which is effectively a price, just a price that's set by government instead of the market. Or we have, in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency can regulate carbon as under its authority to protect the environment, and use its regulatory framework to reduce greenhouse gases, which in effect, again, imposes a cost on the use of carbon and creates a carbon price. Now that may not be what every other nation needs to do. It is the most efficient means of the U.S. addressing its challenges with reducing carbon production to meet its goals by 2050. And so we are not dictating to the rest of the world how you get to the point you get. We're just saying that we're doing this, and every other nation is going to have to step up if they're going to be able to stay competitive in the new global economy with new energy and also save the planet in the bargain. Fourth and finally, we aren't just doing this at a federal level in the United States. We've got state and local governments, companies, individuals, and they're leading. They aren't waiting to be led. That's especially true in my home state, California, where the state and local communities have pushed to develop their own initiatives, their own renewable power portfolios, and they've made the state among the top in the world in renewable power generation. One thing that I was always proud of when I worked in California, and as Harvey mentioned, I chaired the California State University Board of Trustees. All of the buildings that we built were LEED certified as a gold or platinum. These are the highest level of environmental protection. It meant that generally they were carbon reducing. They were lowest energy requirements. They were, good buildings. And in California generally, we have actually maintained on a per capita level the same energy consumption as we did in the 1970s. Now, we've got more people, but on a per capita level, notwithstanding the fact that everyone's got 3 computers and 5, huge TVs, and everyone's got a BlackBerry, and every plug in your house has one of these jacks that now has, 10 plugs stuck to it, and you're just sucking energy all day long. In California, we have maintained the same per capita energy use through more efficient means, by requiring that appliances operate in a more energy efficient manner, and by creating incentives for people to use that, including in our buildings. So, next issue is, how do we see this shaping up internationally? Now, I've talked about what the U.S. is doing. There's been a lot of hand-wringing ever since Copenhagen. Anyone willing to raise your hand that you wrung your hand? Yeah, right. I mean, you're scientists. You're like, what is the matter with the politicians? Why can't they agree on anything? What occurred? Frankly, I think that the concern about Copenhagen has a lot more to do with media coverage of it and people's expectations coming into Copenhagen than what Copenhagen actually produced. So we should be real about what actually happened in Copenhagen. There was some dysfunction. There was some chaos in the process. The outcome wasn't perfect. Wasn't what some of our countries had hoped for. But the nations of the world came together for the very first time and agreed that we need to do something about climate change, that we need to set a cap across the board for every nation to reduce increasing temperatures by 2 degrees, beyond 2 degrees. We set specific targets for all major economies, and we included transparency provisions to ensure that the countries did what they promised they were going to do, and that we could all track and evaluate it. And we created a series of enormous funds for the poorest and most vulnerable nations to make sure that they developed in a sustainable manner. This is a huge accomplishment. The people who are disappointed had hoped that with a different process or with greater cooperation from some nations, that all of the world's leaders would sort of link arms and take a giant leap of faith together. But we took a big step together, not a leap. But we have to have some perspective on this. It was only a decade ago that the US Senate voted 95-0 against the Kyoto Protocol. At that time, the notion of a broad international agreement involving the largest carbon emitters was a pipe dream. And yet today, reducing greenhouse gases is the top of the world's agenda. Now, while we may not be running yet, or leaping yet, we're moving in the same direction for the first time in history. More than 136 countries have now signed on, associated themselves with the Accord, and there are more concrete action plans by countries to control emissions than there have ever been before. The other great achievement of Copenhagen is that it signaled a change in thinking. If Copenhagen had ended without an accord because of fear of the unknown of other nations, or the fear of the unknown in other nations, fear of other nations, just fear, we wouldn't have merely missed an opportunity. We would have taken 2 steps back, because it would have meant that the major nations of the world still thought about energy as a zero-sum game. Instead, the very fact of an agreement at all among these nations means that developing and developed nations together get it. They understand. Protecting an industry or a resource sector won't help them if the markets break down and their customers are broke at the end of the day. A short-term advantage right now because they sit on a particular resource deposit or they've built up an industry in a particular way won't matter if their factories and their properties are swamped by flooding or extreme weather events. If their workers are starved by drought or crop failure, and their people are poisoned by poor air quality. There is, at last, I think, some understanding that what people call the hard way, which is changing your energy system, is actually the easier way than continuing the energy systems that we have. So now the challenge is to build on that consciousness, build on that momentum, to ensure that global emissions reductions are sustained and that they're sufficient over time. And in that respect, Copenhagen obviously wasn't the end of the process. It was the beginning of a process. The targets that countries have agreed to set won't get us where we need to be by 2050 at this point. And there are still some very big challenges. One great challenge is going to be spurring on developing economies, many of which have never offered any mitigation targets of any kind on any subject before. And so they're trying to figure out how to meet their commitment. They're willing to commit, they just don't have the bureaucratic administrative infrastructure to do this sort of thing. And so ultimately, an international climate agreement isn't just about limiting carbon emissions, but it has to complement and promote sustainable economic development by moving these countries forward so that they can have the effective governance that will let them move to a low carbon economy. The other problem is countries are going to move at different paces. Developing countries are moving at a slightly different pace than developed countries, such as the US, Australia, other countries where our economies are going in a positive direction right now. I think the US, we're projecting 3.6% growth this year. Australia, slightly higher. But then you have other emerging economies that start at a lower place but are moving much more quickly. China, India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa. And then you've got other countries that, they are not in a positive direction yet. So they're all moving at different stages. And that's why I have to work through the Major Economies Forum to find ways that we can lead together. This may sound dull to scientists, but just as policymakers sometimes glaze over when they hear science, we have to wake them up and say, this is why what we're doing is important. For scientists, I think letting you know how the politics of this is working is essential for you to understand how your information will be received and used, so that you can make sure that it's reaching the right ears and not being misinterpreted by those ears for political gain. I think the second big challenge is resisting delay. We know that the cost of investing in new energy sources, as countries like the US, Australia, China, India, we're all working to do, are going to keep growing. The costs are going to keep growing the longer we delay. So we need to take actions that encourage innovation now. I see some very positive signs of this. Just recently, in the United States, the President signed another package of $3 billion for new grants and tax incentives for renewable energy projects in the US. And it was encouraging to see how many of those projects were out there ready to apply for that money. You put $3 billion out there, and you wonder how many companies are ready to actually seize on that kind of capital. In fact, that program, we just went out a few weeks ago, it's already received applications for more than $9 billion in projects. There are plenty of projects out there, and so I see that as a very positive sign in terms of the fact that industry gets it and that innovators get it. Third, we need to keep our hand on the throttle. But at the same time, we need to be realistic that this is not something that's going to magically transform in a decade. This is a tough, long effort. For the foreseeable future, the next few years, we likely will not have enough clean, sustainable energy to pick up the increase in demand around the world, let alone to replace all the existing energy demand that we have. So we're going to need both a sustained commitment and some new technological breakthroughs to help us achieve our goals. We need to be thoughtful about what we promise ourselves in order to avoid having people become frustrated and disillusioned. And whatever we promise, we have to be able to deliver. So we're walking a very fine line here. Challenging ourselves to achieve, but not breaking political will by setting targets that we can't meet. I remember during the campaign, there were all these people who said, by 2010, we should have a clean, sustainable energy system. And I said, I wish it were true, but that can't happen. We don't have technology, we don't have the infrastructure. So let's be realistic about how long it will take to get to these different milestones and to set aggressive but achievable milestones. It's going to be hard. But the president said, it's, you know, as Winston Churchill said, you know, this is a sort of a hellish or devilish predicament that we're in. Our economies depend entirely on these resources, and we need to shift out of them, and we have all these entrenched interests that are resisting it, and it's hard technologically to develop the answers, and politically there are people fighting about it. But, you know, Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep on going. And that's been the president's attitude, which is this is tough, and it's only going to stop being tough when we've pushed all the way through it. So he is committed to driving this legislation through. People said he couldn't get health care through. People said he couldn't get finance reform through. We've had the most significant effort and achievement in reducing nuclear proliferation in 40 years, all in the first year and a half. We will get comprehensive energy through this administration. And so I want to thank you, because we couldn't do this work without all of you. It's your passion, it's your energy, it's your insights, it's the information, the honest, objective information that you produce that ultimately drives policy. It couldn't be done without you, and we're going to need you for the future. So I want to thank you and the hundreds of others like you. And as a friend of mine once said, whenever you get discouraged, just remember 3 words. Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. You're willing to take some questions now, I believe.
I'd be happy to.
So
Feel free to ask Elvis questions. That's not good to get in trouble.
Firstly, thank you for attempting to bridge the gap between science and policy. I think that's very important. In that vein, you've spoken a lot about energy and transport, which are of course symbolic of climate change mitigation. However, water issues have become, or are becoming slowly, a symbol of climate change adaptation, whether it's extremes, droughts, floods, or just supply, water quality, anything from sea level rise to glaciers. This is a governance question, how is the US looking at water governance in terms of interstate management of catchments? I guess avoiding conflict and promoting collaboration in order to manage water resources.
That was a very good insight and good question. The United States is learning a lot from Australia. You've been ahead of us in terms of drought, in terms of having to deal with water scarcity. And so we're looking at a lot of the things that you've done just in terms of conservation, water management. In terms of what we're trying to do, we don't run into a lot of interstate disputes that are irreconcilable on water management, water usage, in part because those types of issues are subject to the original jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court. And so we have special masters who deal with these water disputes between states. And that you wouldn't expect the United States Supreme Court justices to, that's part of their job description, but it is. And that has gone on historically. The bigger issues are how we generate more water as opposed to how we allocate water between systems. We have some, and before I get there, look, we don't have it perfectly worked out. For example, in California, we have a real fight between people who say we need more water and people who say if we do the things that are required to release more water into certain sections of the state, we're going to fundamentally disrupt important habitats and destroy conservation values. So there's a real tug of war that is constantly going on. Most of the water in Southern California comes from Northern California. And there are ways that you could increase the flow, but not without having tremendous environmental impact. And so that is the ongoing debate. But we work through that mostly through the legal system, environmental impact statements, those sorts of things. The bigger issue is how you generate more water. And I think desalinization is now becoming a subject which is gaining more and more interest in the U.S. You'll probably see more investment in it.
You're gonna have to.
No, well, I'll defer to you, Harvey. You can, the young guys.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your nice speech. You talk a lot about technology and how the technology is more efficient, and in California, for example, and people are apparently consuming less. But I wonder about the country and what is it doing in terms of education. So, are people expected to consume less, or just expecting technology fix for being more efficient in using energy?
Well, we are becoming more efficient and more conscious of our energy use. If you look at advertising in the United States, the energy companies like PG&E, other Pacific Gas and Electric, a lot of their advertising is about how you can save energy and still enjoy the same quality of life. You can still have your computer, but you don't need to leave it on 24 hours a day. You can turn it off. There are some myths that people have that, well, it takes so much energy to turn the light on that you're better off leaving it on all day long. People actually believe that, and so PG&E is out there debunking it, saying, actually, there's a tiny infinitesimal increase in the energy demand from turning it on as opposed to just leaving it on for a second. After a second, that advantage is gone. So turn your light off. That's the kind of messaging that's going on. Now, is it taking root? It takes a while. It really takes a while for people to get it. I remember when recycling started in the United States. And Americans, and I hate to admit it, but myself included, was like, oh, they want me to sort my garbage? And again, people are like, socialism. This is, this is the beginning of a tyrannical state. Now the government's telling you to sort your garbage. What will be next? And now everyone sorts their garbage. It's not a big deal. You got your bins, this is a plastic one. People feel proud of sorting their garbage. But it takes a while. And we're in that same phase. People think that sorting their garbage will dramatically degrade their quality of life. Now they're like, it improved my quality of life. It wasn't that big a deal. What do I need to do next? So I think we're moving in more of an energy efficient manner, but you need policymakers. You need policymakers to actually say, here is a real incentive. If you put solar panels on your roof, here's how you're going to save money long term by doing it. And a lot of consumers, to use a golf analogy, you wait till the hole stops moving before you putt. They say, okay, I'm ready to embrace a new technology. You just tell me, which technology I should be embracing, which energy saving efforts I should embrace. Because recycling worked. Tell me what's the next recycling.
Thank you. I'm a social scientist, and when you mentioned technological revolution, it reminded me of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And raised some alarm bells about that the Industrial Revolution really was what started the kind of climate mess we're in now, and I'm kind of nervous that maybe there's unanticipated risks involved with the next technological revolution. But also, I think if anything we can learn from the Industrial Revolution was that there was unprecedented social change associated with that. And I was just wondering what type of planning is being done in the US to think about the social changes that might accompany this technological revolution that's being planned.
No, and I think there is a good deal of thought going into evaluating what a clean tech world looks like. Human civilizations have always had certain limits that they that are assumed, and that determine the scope and extent of that civilization's growth. One is, there's a finite amount of land, finite amount of food, finite amount of water. and finite amount of energy. The concept that you could develop technologies that take energy off the table as something that we think of as finite or limited opens up a whole new range of thinking. And you're right, there will be all types of unintended consequences. The general view, though, is that that's a high-class problem to have. We have liberated our society from one of its limitations. But it's going to be up to policymakers and others to manage it so that we don't have some negative consequences. And one thing you want to make sure is that the new technologies don't produce their own hazards. One thing is that you want to make sure that the nations that develop this technology sooner rather than later don't develop in ways that harm the other nations that have also have an important interest in obtaining the technology. You don't want to hold it hostage. We deal with that with, for example, the internet. The internet was something that didn't exist 20 years ago. Now it exists, and we have all sorts of conversations internationally about how you manage the internet. But it's a good problem to have. We all communicate better. We all know more, have greater access to information than we've ever had in human history. So that is, of course, from our. But there is a lot of thinking going on about this.
I think you've discussed a lot about the mitigation policy, and my question now about adaptation policy, and I think importance of support. I will frame my question this way: like, how would the U.S. Administration treat climate change adaptation funding as an additionality to the already much needed development funding in developing countries? Thank you.
I just thought I'd add to your comment because it's quite similar. My question is also on adaptation, but migration due to climate change. I'm from the Maldives, and with the current commitment levels on mitigation, we're already facing pretty devastating effects, including perhaps a total nation becoming climate refugees, or as our president puts it, buying land in another country and relocating completely, which has its many challenges, as you might be aware, but most importantly of which might be the loss of sovereignty, which is faced by a lot of other small island development states in the Pacific and other places in the world. So my question is, what is the US's view on this issue, and perhaps even your own personal opinion on this would be good to hear about. Thanks.
Well, the U.S. is looking at two things. One is that if you start making progress, it's interesting how momentum just gathers and you go faster than you expect once you can get through the most difficult part of getting started. If you look at the science around the hole in the ozone layer and efforts by nations to address ozone depletion, the general view was that it was already too late, and the best we could do is prevent extensive increases in damage, but that generally the ozone was unlikely to repair itself. And what we found is that as efforts gathered steam among nations, that we actually had better results than had been predicted. And once you start getting better results, people become encouraged that we're actually on the right track. We should invest more in this. I think we're likely to see a similar thing happen with climate change. If we can get people off the dime and we can see improvements, then you're more likely to have a pile-on where people want to keep improving on that work because they know it works. At the same time, you contingency plan. We plan for dislocations around the world. Our national security teams spend a lot of time doing what are called tabletop exercises, where they try and imagine a scenario, and how do we address them? And so we're doing the same thing with possible climate change, migration, and refugees. You know, how does the world community step up and address it? And that's not something that we can do alone as the U.S. We work with our partners around the world to try and model solutions in the event that some of our estimates are wrong, or that that countries don't step up and do the things that we know we need to do.
We're running out of time, but I'd like to give a couple more people
Yeah,
a chance. Mike?
Yes.
Until I see our diplomacy people start going, or until I see the news cameras really smiling because I said something terrible, then I'll keep going.
Mike?
A lot of the doubters of people who vested interests who would like to keep the status quo going say that rapid transition to renewable energies is going to cause major job losses in existing industries in the short term, and it'll impact, in Australia's case, very negatively on growth. I would just like to I don't want you to say anything about Australia, but I would like to sort of tease out from you, if you have those figures, the Californian experience. You mentioned that since, well, for 40 years nearly, California's produced exactly the same amount of greenhouse gas. What per capita? So what is effectively the gross domestic product been doing in the meantime?
Well, again, I can't talk about other countries, and every country's experience is different because they have a different mix of energy sources and energy demands. But with respect to California, I can't say whether their emissions levels have remained constant, but their energy consumption levels have remained constant. And since they've been moving to more green technologies, it may be that their emissions on a per capita level have actually been reducing. So I think that's a possibility. At the same time, California, if it were a country, would I think be the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. And it has grown dramatically since the 1970s. It's not having its best period right now. But if you're just looking for historical reference points, the commitment of the United States is not that we are, have made a suicide pact, that we are going to solve the energy problem by going broke. It's quite the opposite. It's that if you model these things out economically in the U.S. for our system, you create many more jobs than you lose, and you have a much more sustainable, efficient, strong economy, both in the short term, but also very much so in the long term, by moving towards these different technologies.
Thanks, Ambassador Bleich. I was hoping to get you to talk a little bit about how your background in human rights contributes to your thinking on climate change. One of the themes in this conference, actually, over the past couple of days, the issue of migration has come up a few times, but in other contexts as well, it's clear that not only does climate change have implications for human rights, but climate policy, adaptation policy, and actually climate science as well. The way in which we do it, the institutions, the perspectives they bring, has a lot to say about what the solutions are, and of course those solutions have big consequences for equity, whether it's within a country or across countries, and even losing entire countries.
Well, there are universal declarations, and there are regional agreements which speak directly to particular rights of individuals to a safe environment, right to travel and right not to travel. And those sorts of things could be interpreted in a legal context as being affected by decisions on climate change. But those are, in most of these contexts, the rights aren't enforceable. They're not things that the government can enforce. They're more aspirational, and there are no international bodies whose responsibility it is to require governments to comply with them. So it is less about the law of human rights than it is about the principle of human rights. And the principle of human rights is that my life is no more valuable than yours. That the country that I was born into doesn't entitle me to a longer life, a better life, a life at all. That each of us needs to look out for one another in one respect. And that in doing that, we enrich each of our lives. If you look at the situation in Haiti, we are, as nations, Australia, the United States, and many other nations, spending a lot of money now to deal with the consequences of Haiti not being in an adequate position to deal with a catastrophe. Their leadership let them down over decades. And when a catastrophe hit, there was going to be loss of life, but there wasn't going to be that kind of loss of life. And now other countries are spending money on it after the death, as opposed to if we could work together globally on human rights issues before those sorts of things happen. So it's about strengthening other countries' ability to deal with human rights violations, or deal with human suffering. It has less to do with talking about human rights violations. The big challenge for us, frankly, is that in our efforts to allow other countries to take care of their people, there's money in the developed world to do that, but many developing countries, or many countries where the greatest human rights abuses exist and where the suffering is greatest, are ones that are corrupt. And it's hard to get the money to go into the right hands for the right purposes. That's a big challenge. But the framework of human rights, I think, supports your concerns, and even more so the heart of human rights supports the view that ultimately nations of the world have to come together and look for a way to make it possible for every person to have an economy that is clean and sustainable, and to take energy off the table is one of the limits on human development. Is that fair?
I'm going to go with two more questions.
Okay.
One here and one here.
Okay, I was, well, I should preface this in the interest of full disclosure, saying that I was one of President Obama's science advisors during the election, so I'm biased. But as a devil's advocate, you were mentioning something that concerns me about responding technologically to climate change, and that's the unintended consequences of new technologies. You talked about desalination, of course, and that's going to be relevant, but it's also incredibly energy-intensive technology. And another aspect is perhaps the increased reliance on nuclear power, which is going to have incredible implications for proliferation. I wondered if you wanted to talk about those two things.
Yeah, no, if there were a perfect energy solution, then I think you'd see the nations of the world gathering behind it. Every one of these energy technologies has challenges, either technological challenges. People talk about solar power and they say, well, we've got storage and transmission issues with that. Hydro can have significant environmental effects if you're storing up water. Wind is unreliable, unpredictable, and can also have some storage and transmission issues. Nuclear is clean and very effective and proven, but at the same time you've got the waste and storage of waste issues, not to mention some security issues associated with that. And if you go through the whole list, you'll find challenges with every one of them. But it's a little bit like the internet. People look at the internet and they say, well, yeah, the internet's great, except someone can get access to my bank account and steal all my money. So the next generation of people focusing on the internet were focusing less on building the internet and more on developing technologies for dealing with the unintended consequences of the internet. I think that's where you're going to see the next big wave of technology. The first wave is developing technologies that really work. Then you're going to have a technological wave on dealing with the unintended consequences or the shortcomings of these systems. There's a lot of research going into reducing radioactive waste from nuclear plants and how to store it in a way which is secure. That's, and if someone perfects it, they become very rich. So there are incentives for that.
Last question.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned about the most important roles of the United States, India, and China in the global field of climate change. and the commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There's a kind of standpoint of view that if China and India are not doing anything, the United States are not going to take a move, and the same things with China and India. I just want to know see your personal thoughts about this kind of paradox, which is this relationship will head for, maybe in Mexico? Thank you.
Well, my sense is that China and India see the same things that we see. You know, this isn't.
Yes, that's right, absolutely.
And and they do. They see the same hazards of having their entire economy based upon oil, gas, and coal. And they also see the potential upside of having, being the first to market with renewable technologies and the first economy to make a major transition. So there's a race among China, India, and the US. Now, we may not always seem that way when you look at the politics of Copenhagen, but if you look at the industries within these countries, the race is on. So I'm not discouraged that the US is going to be a position where we figure out the solution, but we decide to, keep it in a box because we don't see China and India moving as quickly. I think it's just the opposite. I think China and India and the US are all seeing who can be first.
Okay, so the time has arrived to call the discussion to a close. I should say to you that there's at least 17 countries represented in the room, maybe 18, and almost certainly a good many of the young people here today will be influencing policy in the future. So we'd like to thank you very much for giving the point of view of the United States and getting people to think about policy aspects. Thank you. If I understand things correctly, there'll be some lunch available.